What is up, Bat Family? Welcome to my recap, review, and breakdown of The Riddler Year 1, Issue 4. This issue was, in particular, a very disturbing one. Now, each issue definitely gets pretty disturbing. I mean, that's why it's, R-rated, I believe. It's like 17 plus. It's a part of the Black Label. As Matt Reeves says, with his villains and, Riddler, in this case, in the first movie, the audience is supposed to have some empathy for him. Like, despite, obviously, where he ended up, obviously can't condone remotely what he does, he wants to explore all of his characters in his Batman saga from a very human standpoint, right? And Riddler in this issue, and we already knew a little bit, quite a bit actually, about his origin, being an orphan, the interrogation scene in that of the Batman, where he talks about being an orphan and what it's like. This goes head over heels into that. There's some additional context that I really enjoyed, seeing Thomas Wayne announce his run for mayor there, having a full-blown conversation with Edward, but mainly just seeing this young, timid, quiet boy who's enduring a very, very rough time at not Wayne Manor, but Gotham City orphanage, still having hope and keeping his head down, keeping to himself, for the future, and seeing that get crumbled and crumbled, somewhat sinking up to the night of the Wayne's death. I did appreciate the character building and seeing the context of what develops that psyche, what develops this young boy who was impressionable and promising to this person who's resigned himself to nothing but, and not to sound too cheesy here, but darkness. Truly, when you go through this issue, or as you'll see me recap in today's video, it truly is a tragic tale, if anything, and his life could have turned out to be something very, very different. So like this video, guys, if you do go on to enjoy it, if you're enjoying these extra lore kind of videos, because this is the Batman, it doesn't get a bunch of views, but I still want to cover it anyway. For those of you who are interested, do consider subscribing, of course, for more the Batman saga videos just like this, and enjoy the little recap and breakdown and some of my thoughts as we explore The Riddler Year 1, Issue 4. The first page picks up with Edward being dropped off to the Gotham City orphanage doorstep, which, as we all know, was once Wayne Manor, and Edward here is abandoned as a baby. Now, all that's left with Edward is a piece of paper that's initialed E.N., as the workers are filling out the intake form, not knowing what name to give him, and as for the cause and reason for being brought in, there's just a simple question mark. Very, very fitting. And as you can see with a lot of this issue, there's a lot of foreshadowing, a lot of building, and almost Easter eggs, if you will, for the character that Edward will become. Now, as the panels continue, Edward is seen in the orphanage as a young boy, as he's playing around with numbers, and a man comes along telling Edward that his biological mother has passed away the night before while she was in care at Arkham Asylum. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I don't know if you guys will agree with me here, but the man who comes in to tell Edward this kind of looks like Oz. Obviously, it's not Oz, but damn, kind of looks like him. Now, one of the workers tells this man that Edward doesn't speak, and that they never know what he's trying to tell them. The worker then tries to spell out Mama with the blocks that Edward is playing with, which is when all of the children in the orphanage race to the window as his car pulls up, and they're wondering if Bruce Wayne is in there. Of course he is, with his mummy and daddy, and the maid's taking care of him, even going on to say that he's the luckiest kid in the world. And this is when we cut to more days in the life of Edward, and this whole issue goes along with different stages of his time in the orphanage. So at this point, we see that the children of the orphanage are singing in the choir, the kids are going to bed, and the workers are freaking out in this moment as they call one another to get a doctor. Now, they're probably whispering in this moment because they don't want to wake up all the other children, but it's too late, as one of the children has passed away. As Edward and the other children are sleeping, this is when we see panels of rats scurrying around the beds, into his slippers, even into Edward's own bed, biting him, and the other children are teasing him in this moment as he reacts to this, telling him to go back to sleep, you crybaby. Now, as a result of this, we then see Edward horrified as he's getting the first of 4 doses of a shot after being bitten by the rats. And as usual with this artwork, I love how the more you experience the trauma from Edward in the panels, the more horrific the imagery gets, mixing the comic illustration with these eerie, lifelike shots at times, like the hands compared to the more cartoonish Edward. This is all quite cool as well, just in how they weave in the commentary from what we heard from the Riddler in the movie in Arkham with Batman, with regards to him talking about Bruce Wayne, his experience of being an orphan. I'm sure you guys will remember the lines of, do you know what being an orphan is? It's 30 kids to a room, 12 years old, and already a drop head numbing the pain. You wake up screaming with rats chewing your fingers, and every winter one of the babies die because it's so cold. But oh no, let's talk about the billionaire with the lying dead daddy, because at least the money makes it go down easy, doesn't it? So this moment here that we're seeing at this part of the issue perfectly syncs up to those scenes that we saw in Arkham with Batman and the Riddler. You know, we have Marie dying here, another orphan. We have rats scurrying around the place. We didn't see drop heads in this issue, but obviously, yeah, it's a horrific childhood. And as this issue unfolds, it just gets worse and worse and worse for little Edward. Now, one thing I was kind of thinking about in this moment, given that you had rats, children literally dying in the cold, you would have thought that the Waynes wouldn't be happy with that, but I suppose that they might have been unaware of it, and this could highlight that despite doing the good deed of donating Wayne Manor to become the Gotham City orphanage, I suppose it's meant to highlight that their privilege blinded them to the conditions of their old Wayne Manor and what life was actually like for the orphans who lived there. And so up next on this page, we visit one of the workers helping Edward overcome his fear of rats, telling him that the best way to kill a rat is to drown it, and this is how he gets over his fear. He holds the rat in the cage over a bucket and tells Edward to open the cage, and he does. And we see a young Edward watch as the rat drowns to death. Now, obviously, this is a pretty disturbing way of helping a kid get over their fear. I mean, even if it is a rat, you know, watching it drown is, yeah, but obviously, again, the foreshadowing here, even though Edward's rats in the movie had mostly been killed by the final events of the Batman, I'd like to think that this lesson here with this worker telling Edward or teaching him about drowning a rat is his idea, his own idea that he brought to fruition in the future with, obviously, the drowning of Gotham with the flooding, and thus somewhat cleansing it in his mind. Now, as the issue unfolds, Edward is once again a bit older, singing in the choir again, rinse and repeat, reading his books, and also writing a list of ingredients ranging from zinc sulfide to hydrogen peroxide, among many other specific ingredients. And I like how this is included here because it shows his, you know, very, very high intelligence from a very, very young age. Not that really needed to be pointed out, but they're still fleshing it out here. And the teacher is even wondering how Edward knows what all of this is. And so after Edward mixed all of his ingredients into a jar, we see him that night as the other kids are getting traumatized by the rats once again. Edward hides under a sheet and reads his book, with the jar he has that he made earlier glowing in the dark with a very green hue, of course, enabling him to read under the sheets and away from the rats as he tries to block out the terror experienced by the other kids. As the panels unfold, we see Edward reading Games of Wit, a book titled Riddle Me This, and he's encouraged to go outside and play with the other children. Now, the other kids outside are looking at a turtle, wondering how strong its shell is, and one kid says, "Let's find out," while holding a rock. He demands Edward to come throw the rock at the turtle to find out the strength of its shell, while mocking him for not having learned to speak. Now, this is once again where the issue gets very disturbing, as we see Edward is forcibly brought over, all the kids chant him to throw the rock, and we get close-up panels of Edward's face, the turtle's eye, and again, Stevan Subic with his illustration here. It gets very detailed when you get very up close, and Edward throws the rock, and we see this bloody rock bounce off, and Edward repeats until the turtle dies. Now, of course, Edward later on is crying, telling himself to stop out of fear of the other kids hearing him, getting his glow-in-the-dark jar to read more riddles, puzzles, and brain games, emphasizing how burying himself into all of this was just once again an escape from the life he endured at the orphanage. And once again, Edward is even older now, and he's still mixing chemicals, and as he's on his way back from doing so, we have the other kids start to bully him again. So he runs into this room, and he kind of lets off some little explosion or something like that. Now, this is when the main ringleader bully who forced Edward to throw the rock at the turtle then gets curious and wants to recreate what Edward did moments before. And let's just say, due to not having the smarts of a young Edward, it quite literally blows up in this bully's face. But here is a very interesting part, because we have the children being told by the headmaster that none other than Thomas Wayne is coming for a visit next month to make a speech to Gotham from the orphanage, and that he'd like the choir to sing as he shares his big news with the world. And of course, as we know, this is his announcement to run for mayor. And so we get that very scene, but expanded out a lot more than what we've ever really known about before, from even seeing photos in the movie to Edward recounting Thomas Wayne visiting the orphanage. So this is where we see that scene of which we saw a brief glimpse of in the movie, and where Thomas Wayne talks about believing in Gotham and its promise, announces his mayoral run, and also the creation of the Gotham Renewal Fund. Now, some of you may remember in the movie the little photo of the younger Edward Nashton standing in the choir looking over at Thomas and Martha and Bruce Wayne. And this is where we actually get that moment in issue 4. Here we see the younger Edward looking over at Bruce Wayne and Thomas, and you can see that as Edward looks at him, and when the panel cuts back to his face, you can see that he's just smiling at Bruce so sweetly. At this point, Edward, obviously in his life, granted that he's already been through a lot, he hasn't quite given up into the darkness, he hasn't given up hope. If anything, in this scene and what unfolds after this, it reignites a hope for Edward that really just gets pulled away again, as we know, of course, which then plummets him further and further into the character he becomes from a very, very fractured childhood. But it's nice just getting glimpses of this, hopeful young boy version of Edward, of whom's life could have gone a very, very, very different way if it wasn't for everything that he experienced growing up with Gotham just kind of being Gotham, and him being one of the casualties of that. So this is where we see Thomas Wayne greet each one of the orphans. And I really enjoyed this extra insight here with Thomas Wayne having a full-on conversation with Edward. And so when he gets to Edward, he's told that he's the boy who can sing but doesn't speak. So Thomas Wayne asks him what's something that the Renewal Fund could do for him, and that it's okay, he can tell him. And Edward speaks, and he says that he wishes he could go to school with other kids like him. And Thomas asks, kids like you how? Edward responds saying, kids who are different. And Thomas says, and how are you different, Edward? And he says, I'm good at math. This is where Thomas says that he could become a doctor like he did because of this, or maybe even come to work in the tech department at Wayne Enterprises. Edward also says that he likes riddles, and so in turn, Thomas tells Edward his own riddle. What is never behind you and always in front of you? The future. Thomas then says, that's right, Edward. Very, very kind of political here and cheesy in a way, but that's right, Edward, because remember, you matter. And obviously, as you can all basically tell here, this is just hammering down on how Edward feels like basically anything else other than mattering in present day. But obviously, it's just really sad because in these panels, you see how this version of Edward is very impressionable, believing in Thomas Wayne's vision for Gotham, for one day him to only develop disdain and resentment for this false promise of renewal that Thomas Wayne put out there. So later on, we see Edward at night, under his bedsheet as usual with his glow-in-the-dark jar, this time with a bunch of news coverage of Thomas Wayne visiting the orphanage, and he's actually filling out his first application to the renewal program. And as we know from previous issues, he's applied again and again and again and again, and they all get rejected after Thomas Wayne's death. And as we know, it's because the Gotham Renewal Fund, even though it maintained its title, it was never really about that. It's because Falcone used it as a front, and he says that he wants to go on to do special math and science school so he can work in the Wayne Tech department someday. And this is when the bully who was disfigured by messing around with Edward's experiments comes over and asks what he's doing under his sheet, and he mocks him for applying to the renewal program, teasing him for his love for Thomas, or as he goes on to say, or is it Bruce? You think you're going to get out of here? You think they're actually going to help you? You think They want kids whose parents didn't even want them, and then he burns his application. Now at this point, what's sad, obviously, is that Edward more or less grows up to evolve into the same mentality that this bully has, and kind of for understandable reasons. He was disregarded, he felt like a nobody, was looked down upon, undervalued, and underappreciated at his work, among a million other things. So this is when we see Edward sometime later filling out yet another application, even leaving Gotham Orphanage and going all the way into the city and going through the front doors of Wayne Enterprises. Now a worker there asks if he's okay, where are your parents? And Edward says that he wanted to deliver this letter to Thomas Wayne. I mean, this poor kid is literally going right into Wayne Enterprises and is like, hey, can you see if you can get this? It's important. And he's told that Thomas Wayne is out tonight, and then they put him in a car back to Gotham Orphanage. And where was Thomas Wayne out that evening, you may be wondering? Well, of course, we then pick up with Edward and the other kids watching TV, and then the news comes on, and the reporter says that we regret to inform you that last night at 10:47 p.m., Thomas and Martha Wayne were shot and killed. They were coming out of the Monarch Theater when the couple was attacked. Thomas and Martha died on site. They are survived by their son, Bruce Wayne, who witnessed the tragedy himself. Now, as the TV shuts off, the panel shows Edward alone, just staring at the TV, even though it's completely off. And obviously, it's heartbreaking watching these panels unfold, and the story we've seen in this issue so far. Edward's life could have gone a much, much different way for all we know. If Thomas Wayne didn't die that night, maybe that letter would have got to him, and he might have been like, hey, that's the kid I met at the orphanage. You know what? I'm going to actually make sure that I send maybe a scholarship his way or something like that. I wouldn't be surprised if Thomas Wayne did something of that nature. But as of this moment, alongside Thomas Wayne's death, so did that version of Edward who had any kind of hope for the future, any idea of things getting better for him, and, believing in Thomas Wayne's vision after already the things that he's endured up until that point. That was all gone in a single moment. And that may sound cheesy on the surface in one way, but I feel like I totally get it, because already this is a kid who was very young and impressionable, already dealing with the horrible conditions in the orphanage, dealing with rats, children dying, as we know from the movie, drop heads at a kid's age, all sorts of things, right? But he still tried to remain positive. He didn't speak, he kept to himself, but he wasn't quite where we're about to visit in the final pages of this issue, and to the man that he becomes. And even though he held on, he got that crucial boost from Thomas Wayne visiting the orphanage and giving him even more hope that everything he's been dealing with so far will not last much longer, hopefully for him. It can maybe be better. Maybe he does matter after all. But that's all gone now. That is all gone, and this just cemented it into Edward's mind. And speaking of hope dying, well man, the next panel, we get into some of the spectacular nightmare fuel that Stevan Subic has often displayed when showcasing Edward's trauma. So with Thomas Wayne gone, letter after letter of Gotham renewal applications are rejected. We see all of this disturbing imagery of Edward dealing with this. And I love how they depict the future somewhat costumed Riddler and Ed. We see Edward fighting himself, the rage that is expressed, him exclaiming that Thomas Wayne promised, somebody help me, with the little innocent version of himself deep down inside. He's even told to grow up, welcome to the real world, by one of the workers at the Gotham Orphanage. I believe the same guy who showed him how to drown a freaking rat. And then we see Edward's journey after this, a new journey for him in a different state of mind. The innocence is gone, and as he says in the comics pages, slowly I turned off the lights. One by one, room by room, foster home after foster home. Now, you would have thought perhaps that getting foster parents and getting out of the Gotham orphanage would be a great thing for him. But as Riddler details in this moment, what happened in those homes, I try to block it out. But it lives in my body, so my body rejects itself like I'm a cancer. Edward's life at this point is just like one bad day on repeat, and each and every panel after this just gets deeper into that fractured version of himself he's become, barely holding things together. And we've had a lot of that in the previous issues at his somewhat present, I say present day, but obviously it's still a prequel, but present day in the other issues. And he wonders about Bruce Wayne, and in comparison to how he viewed him before, you now start to see the bitterness come out. The kind of bitterness that was expressed as we went over through other children in the orphanage. Does he have someone holding his face together? Or does he love his own face? He's the luckiest boy in the world after all. He's got it all. We then see a panel with Bruce and Alfred, papers of Gotham's orphan son, Bruce Wayne attending a private school, his parents' funeral. He's got it all. He's loved by everyone. The bitterness is just growing and growing at this point, ringing to those words in the movie, as displayed in this panel here, Bruce Wayne, the orphan. Now, when Edward is old enough to finally leave the orphanage, he does so. I believe even before this, he wrote a letter to the DA in order to get emancipated, and then he goes off to the Gotham Community College, having done the whole semester's book in the first night. His teacher then recommends him to apply to a job, and that is, of course, for his forensic accounting role at the company KTMJ, working for Mr. Stone, of whom, as we know, is in Falcone's pocket. He then looks back to a younger version of himself before going into his new job and meeting Mr. Stone on the final panels of this issue, and his younger self says, "Don't leave me here, I'm scared of the dark." And Edward goes into the building, entering the darkness that is depicted on the panel, as if he's abandoning that older version of himself with the hopes, the ambitions of that small child, leaving him with, as he said earlier in the panels, snuffing himself out into the black so the pain doesn't eat him alive. But there's that part of him that I like in how it's so included here, that doesn't want to live in the black, that the present self is now embraced. But the end of the issue has Edward to this point in his life where he's just completely and utterly resigned himself to it. And so, there we have it. And I don't know about you, but like, I'm making this video, and I know I'm a little bit late to it, right after reading it. And I feel pretty like, a bit deflated. And again, as I said at the beginning of the video, it's kind of like Joker, right? Even with Arthur, you can, and I've always said the most interesting villains are not one-dimensional villains who, like, oh, I'm going to dominate the world or do this for the sake of it. Arguably there can be some interesting things there. Joker can be a bit crazy for crazy's sake, but compelling villains with backstory and enough character building, enough complicated history that informs their future psyche, just like this, with a very rich traumatic childhood with what Edward endured. Freaking fly, go away. I really enjoyed it, but I just feel really sad about it at the same time. Now, as I've already mentioned a few times, this took a break from, the present day stuff as he's gearing his way into finding more about the whole thing with the Gotham Renewal Fund, Falcone. So you have to think the final 2 issues of this 6-issue comic book run will be going quite deep into that. Maybe, as some of us have theorized, perhaps the mayor at the beginning of the Batman movie wasn't his first victim. It could even be Mr. Stone, but that might not be true, because maybe that could lead too many breadcrumbs to Edward, but then again, maybe they just wouldn't suspect him, and they might think it's his ties to the mob and Falcone and those who Mr. Stone got mixed up with. But I am really expecting some cool things with regards to the final transformation into Riddler. He's been getting his way there in issues 1, 2, and 3, very much so delving into all of it and finally cracking, Gotham Renewal Fund at the end of issue 3. But this issue, I didn't remotely mind going into full flashback mode, because a character like this, especially with a comic run that's all about him, deserves that time, borderline doing a character study issue of what made him who he is, what happened to get him to this point, even where we pick up with issue 1, where he's not quite the Riddler yet at all. He hasn't really stumbled across anything major, but he's still at such a bitter point of his life, walking around Gotham City, listening to a podcast, trying to be positive, but having this inner monologue of just saying this is basically BS the whole time. It's super interesting, a super interesting issue, and I'm really enjoying this. I'm really enjoying that Paul Dano did this in the first place. I love the illustrations by Stevan Subic, they never cease to amaze me, and they correlate so well with whatever's going on in the Riddler's mind in each panel. It's truly great stuff. So let me know what you thought of this issue down in the comments below. What was your favorite moment? Do you have any theories for when we get into issue 5? That is mainly everything for this issue of the Riddler Year 1. Let's wait another couple of months now until the next issue. I hope you guys enjoyed it, though. In all seriousness, I would really appreciate a like. Maybe consider subscribing if you just happen to stumble across this video and you're brand new and you're still here right now. That would be awesome. But until next time, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day. I'll see you, Bat Family, in the next video. Goodbye.